right, so hello everybody, welcome. We're doing a little something different today. You know, typically I do more animated videos, and I rarely do these, but I do these types of interviews when I feel there's a book that comes out that Christians should get and should read. And a book just came out today by biochemist Cy Gart. Now, if you are on YouTube a lot or you're familiar with this community, you know you hear all the time from atheists claiming that the more they study science, the less likely they get religious. And in fact, as people grow up and they shed their old religious ideas and look more into science, they just become atheists. Well, the interesting thing is I have here today Cy Gart, who was an atheist and became a Christian. And he wrote a book talking about his experience. So we're going to talk about his book today. The book just came out. It was just released today. After you hear this interview, go grab his book off Amazon or whatever site you find that's you use for book, because this is a phenomenal book. When I was reading it, it made me think this is like Francis Collins 2.0, because I read his book, The Language of God, and I felt this was like that in a lot of ways, but more in depth, offers more interesting tidbits in there. So, Sai, thanks for coming on talking about your book with my audience here. I appreciate you doing that.
Well, thanks, and thanks for that introduction about the book. Anytime I'm ever compared to Francis Collins is a good day. So, thank
Well,
you.
yeah, and I'll be honest, I enjoyed this more than Francis Collins' book, I have to say. I think you did just a better job overall. I mean, I think Francis Collins' book was great, especially for its time, but I really think you went the extra mile, building on it, some of the things he did, and making improvements in some sort of areas.
Oh, thank you.
So let's start by talking first what you detail in the book. This book covers a lot of interesting facts with regarding science and things that got you interested in theism, but it's also a story of your journey from atheism to Christianity. So first tell us, who you are, your background, and why you decided to write this book.
Okay. As you mentioned, I'm a biochemist. I got a PhD in biochemistry and then began doing academic research in a number of areas related to biochemistry. But before that, the best way to introduce my background is to talk about what my philosophical religious background was. And that was, I was raised in a family that was completely atheistic. And in fact, my parents had been members of the American Communist Party in the 30s and remained very left wing the rest of their lives. And their atheism was militant. They didn't just think they didn't believe in a God. They were very anti-religion. They thought Christianity was the worst thing in human history. They were absolutely positive that no God existed. And I absorbed all those ideas. And it wasn't just my parents. That was true for the extended family going back several generations and also sideways. So I just thought it was perfectly normal to be an atheist. I never even thought about the fact that I was an atheist. I just assumed, the idea of God was just some silly legend that a few people believed in. It didn't mean anything to me. So that's where I started from, and it took a long time to get where I am today. And the first thing that happened, and the book is kind of divided into two or three sections. It's two parts, but the first thing I talk about is how my certainty on atheism was shaken by what I was learning in science. And that included both things I was reading about physics, which were very strange, and things I was also learning about biology and then doing research on. So that didn't make me a theist. I never saw God in any of that scientific information that I was getting. But it did shake my certainty in materialism and in the idea that I had grown up with that everything can be explained fairly simply by a materialistic view of the universe and everything in it. And I started thinking, well, not quite. That doesn't seem right. And it seems like there's something else going on, and I don't know what that is. And I spent decades pursuing that. And then the second part of the story is how I actually came to faith. And that was due to a number of things, which we'll get into. But what I like to say is that none of that would have happened if I had not gone through the experience of understanding from science that my initial philosophy, my initial worldview of strict atheism was not right. It just didn't satisfy me. And so I was open to other things. I was open when a friend of mine asked me to go to mass with her. I'd never been in a church in my life. This was in my 40s. I said yes. I was terrified, but I went, and that was an eye-opening experience. So the first thing that probably we should talk about is, and the first part of the book is what was it about science that I was learning that rocked my initial faith in a very different kind of world that I now believe in.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. You mentioned a number of things in here, from chaos and complexity theory to fractals. But
Hmm.
one of the things you really hit on a lot, which I thoroughly enjoyed, was the observer effect in quantum theory,
Hmm.
which I'm sure people are aware. I talk a lot about that on this channel. So why did quantum mechanics make you question the atheistic worldview? I thought this was all just quantum woo.
Right. And I love that. I love that expression, quantum woo. We've both heard it a lot, and what it really implies is that, and I guess there are a few folks who kind of misuse the idea of quantum theory, in a way that is not quite rigorous. But what this implies is that because of the nature of quantum mechanics, it has something to do uh, with describing the fact that there are supernatural phenomena, and that's just not true. Quantum mechanics has nothing to do with the supernatural. It's a description of the natural world, and what it tells us about the natural world, the world we all know and live in, is that it's not what we thought it was. It's not deterministic. It's not something that we can look at and understand and measure, and then we know everything. It's a whole different way of seeing reality. And I'm not talking about supernatural reality. I'm talking about just the reality that scientists study. So yeah, so what I learned was some things which are very strikingly strange, and that is things like electrons don't exist in a particular place. They exist in a probability space, and they only actually settle to a particular spot or particular momentum, and when they're observed, and that's called the collapse of the wave function. And a wave function is basically a way of expressing the probability of where the electron is. So you can't say the electron is here and look at a spot. You can say it has a probability of being there. And of course, that destroys determinism at that level, because determinism depends on being able to know everything there is to know about initial conditions. And we can't do that in terms of what elementary particles are doing because of quantum theory. Now, the weird thing is that if you observe the electron, it collapses. The wave function collapses, and you actually can see where it is. But why should that be? What rational, logical sense does it make that something becomes measurable when you look at it and is not measurable when you don't look at it? And I know some people have said, well, it's the measuring device. No, that's not it. That's Bell's theorem and other things have shown that's not the reason. It's actually a fundamental part of nature that it exists in only a probability phase until it's observed. And then the question is, who's an observer? Who can be the observer? And that's a whole nother very complex issue.
Oh
But
yeah, I thought you explained it really well in your book. In the future, I hope to write books on this after I get my master's degree. But I really enjoy the way you were able to articulate it and simplify it in this book, and I took notes on that because I thought that was spot on. I've read a lot of quantum physicists when they even encountered the same things you were finding here, and they
mhm,
were buffooned by a lot of this, and it
yeah,
destroyed their ideas of materialism. But I mean, we always hear the opposite. We hear the more that people study science, the more the atheistic they're going to become. And it just seems like, well, that might not be the case. And you mentioned not only that, but fine tuning and all sorts of other
right,
things that were really
right.
starting to challenge your atheism.
In the book, I have a quote from Werner Heisenberg, who was a Christian and said There's some dispute as to whether he actually said it, but I think he did. Actually, he was quoting somebody else as well, but he said the first gulp from the glass of science makes you an atheist, but when you reach the bottom, you'll find God there.
Hmm.
So I think that that is true. When you just start studying science, and that was certainly true for me, when I was a student and even a graduate student to some degree, everything I was learning about the wonders of biochemistry made me just feel, oh, this is wonderful and beautiful, and it's all true. It's all provably true, and it's absolutely incredible. And I just thought it was fantastic. And it didn't raise any major questions in my mind until later when I started wondering, wait a minute, how did this happen? how did this wonderful, incredibly complex biochemical systems that exist in life, how did they get that way? I mean, yes, evolution, of course, is an important thing, but it doesn't explain the origin. And so that's a question I keep asking to this day because and I actually started doing a little work on that, a little bit in collaboration with some other people. There's some really important questions about the origin of life that some of them are probably going to be answered. It just takes a lot more work, but some of them are almost basic questions that I'm not sure if they have an answer. So at this stage, I think that if you start studying a little science, everything makes great sense and you're fine. And if you study physics, you're not going to get to quantum theory for quite a while. So, when you learn Newtonian physics, oh, it's just wonderful. All the equations work and the equations work in quantum theory too. But remember, when you're looking at Schrodinger's equation, one of the important terms is the square root of -1, which is an imaginary number. So that already tells you, that may not be quite as rational as some of the other simpler equations that you're studying. So when you get to a more advanced level in science, I think, yeah, you really have to work hard to resist questioning how wonderful is your materialistic outlook.
Oh yeah, and I've heard the same from reading people like Fred Kuttner and Paul Davies as well.
Yeah.
But so getting back to the book, so
Hmm.
talk about where you were at this point. I mean, you were studying science for quite some while, and it was shaking your underlying foundations.
Yeah.
But you say you weren't a theist yet, and I get
Oh
the kind of
no.
same feeling from a lot of atheists or agnostics I debate online. Is that they
Right.
don't feel like they can make the final leap to Christianity sometimes. I hear
Right.
this more in private than I do maybe on like a public comment section or something. But so how did you finally become a Christian? You mentioned some
Right.
dreams you had. Why were those important? And talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I was an agnostic for a good part of that period. I mean, as an adult, doing science and at the same time thinking about, the larger questions in life. And I didn't really think about God much. I didn't believe in God, but I wasn't sure that it was impossible. And a number of things happened. I mentioned going to a church, and I was really struck by, the love and the friendship and the just the general pleasure of being in church, which was a complete surprise to me. I expected, a horrific experience from what I'd been taught. And then I read the Gospels, and I was very shocked because the Gospels seemed very inspirational and very beautiful to me. And what an incredible figure this guy, Jesus Christ, was an amazing character, walking around doing stuff and talking and saying great things. And that was all a surprise to me. And I was not a Christian. I did not believe in God. I couldn't get there. But all of that further broke down my huge wall of resistance, which did not let me hear the call because I know the call was coming. Now I know it because I remember things. But at the time, I never heard anything. And I just thought, nothing's happening. But all of those experiences, reading the Gospels, going to a church, talking to a few people, and a few experiences I had the effect of crumbling that resistance. And as I think what happened was I had two dreams in particular, which are described in the book, which both of which involved the figure of a man who was obviously Jesus, and they were very powerful dreams, and they really got me thinking about what's going on here. was that Jesus in the dream? I mean, is what he said true? And I started really thinking about that. And I went to church more often. I really felt like I was ready to become a Christian, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't get over the threshold. It was too much saying, well, you can't believe in something like that. You're a scientist. How can you, profess a faith and something you can't see, God and all that? And it was an argument I was having with myself. And then one day I was unexpectedly, I was driving actually, and I was seized by the Holy Spirit in a way that, you read about. I had read about, but never expected it to happen. And it happened. And by the time that incident was over, and that's described in great detail in the book too, I had to pull over. And even thinking about it, I get emotional. I pulled over, started crying, and I was a Christian. I realized I was, and there was no going back at that point. I had been touched by God. However, I know I didn't tell anybody. And what came next is a whole nother story. And one of the things that came next, you mentioned Francis Collins and the language of God. I thought I was the only scientist who had ever believed in God. Seriously thought that. I thought no one else, I didn't know any history. I didn't know what had happened. But I thought, well, this is so weird. I don't know how I can deal with this. And then when I read the language of God, I saw that I was not alone. And of course, then BioLogos started. I joined the ASA, and I met many, many wonderful Christians who were scientists, and I'm now part of that community.
What I really liked about it is when you talk about the dreams, is that they weren't like these giant experiences where Jesus like pops out of a cloud and says, "Worship me." They
Right.
basically just helped you to rationally get to a place where you just realized you just had to let go of
Yeah,
these
well,
fears.
I can describe one of them. I mean, I don't think it'll stop anyone from buying the book. So the one that was the first one actually, which I wasn't quite sure what it meant when it happened, was I was dangling off the edge of a cliff, and I have terrible fear of heights, so that was a terrifying feeling for me. I was holding on to a boulder that was sort of stuck into the side of the cliff. I didn't know what to do, and then I heard a voice. There was someone standing around I guess, on the cliff, and the voice said, "Just let go." And I thought, let go? I'll fall. That's crazy. But he was insistent. He said, just let go. And I let go. And as I did so, the whole world turned 90 degrees. And instead of being on a cliff dangling, I was lying on the ground, holding onto this boulder, which I had let go of.
I want
Yeah,
to say about the dreams is that what I found interesting is that the way you sort of described them is that they weren't like these big emotional
that's right.
experiences you had. It
Exactly.
seems like that prior to the dreams, you rationally saw how Christian theism could make sense. You just had different emotional fears holding you back, and they really just helped you to let go of those things.
Exactly.
So
That's what he meant. And it's interesting how often in discussions with people on Twitter, sometimes atheists, sometimes other Christians, I have used those words. I've said, just let go. Because people who where I was, they have this, well, I can't believe in this irrational nonsense. Well, let go of that. You can believe. And
yes,
I didn't know at the time when I woke up from the dream. I didn't know that was Jesus. I didn't really know who that was, and I didn't know what it meant. And I let go, and why? How? Then I thought, but that was like a miracle that everything turned around, and maybe it was always that way. And I just thought I was hanging from a rock, and it turned out I wasn't. That it was just something in my brain was giving me a distorted view of reality. And of course, later I realized, yes, that's
yeah.
exactly.
I just thought it was a very interesting part of the book that you basically just went into that rationally it all made sense, but there are still can be emotional objections people can have before they
Yeah,
convert to Christianity. It's not
absolutely.
just the other way around. When people become atheists, it's not just because of pure logic, and when people become
Oh
Christian,
no.
it's not just because of pure emotion. It's always a mix of those things.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
So I don't want to give too much away of the book, but let's move on. But so when you became a Christian, you obviously learned to reject that evil theory of evolution, and you realized the Earth was 6,000 years old, and it might even be flat. I mean, because all Christians have to believe that, right?
I actually thought that because I literally didn't know any other Christians. I mean, I knew a couple. I knew a few Catholics, but I didn't know any Protestants, and I didn't know what the Christian view was about science. I didn't even know what the Catholic view was. And this is one of the reasons I was disturbed. I wasn't tempted to give up my newfound faith, but I certainly wasn't going to give up my scientific worldview. And as a biologist, I certainly know a lot about evolution, and I now think of it as God's tool for creation of life, but that's another story.
Hmm.
But at the time, I didn't. And then when I read Francis' book and met people at BioLogos, which was basically an organization, I'll give them a plug here, biologos.org, an organization founded by Francis and that remains a strong voice for the compatibility between mainstream science and Christian faith. And some great books have come out of there about evolution, about origins, some great people. And so, yeah, I didn't give up my understanding of evolution, and I was very happy when I found out I really didn't have to.
Yes, that's another thing we try to promote on this channel is the idea that Genesis really doesn't care about scientific origins of humanity. It's not its focus, and it's perfectly compatible. Anyone who says otherwise really hasn't studied the text that much.
Yeah,
Let's,
I mean, I met John Walton a couple of times. I've read some of his books. He's an amazing scholar. You know him very well.
Mhm. Oh yeah, but
And,
yeah,
that really helped me quite a bit.
yeah, that's always good. I get a lot of reaction from struggling Christians who are kind of in that same boat, worrying that they have to lose their faith because of modern
Mhm.
science, and there's no
Right.
reason to. So
Well,
moving on ahead, you talk at the end of the book. It was probably one of my favorite parts. You talk about intelligent design advocates, and you defend evolution in this book, which of course is surprising because typically when people become Christians, sometimes they go down the intelligent design road and they end up rejecting evolution.
mhm.
So, what do you think about intelligent design advocates when they're talking about evolution? What do they get wrong? What do they get right? What's kind of going on here with their arguments and why you didn't fall into their boat?
Well, that's a very good question. Actually, I do dialogue with a number of ID advocates. I've had some very interesting discussions with Ann Gager, who's part of the Discovery Institute. We met at an ASA meeting, American Scientific Affiliation. And there are parts of ID that I find interesting and worth pursuing, such as the whole question of the origin of life. Steve Meyer's book, Signature in the Cell, spends a lot of time on that and talks about the origin of information, the origin of a code. My interest is in the origin of the protein synthesis system. As a biochemist, I find that remarkable, and that's a system that's required for evolution. You can't have evolution unless you have a very good copying mechanism, which at the same time also produces the exact proteins at a very low error rate, and that's required for evolution. But you can't have evolution make that system because it's required for evolution, so it has to already be there. So if the DNA protein mechanism of life, which we now have in all living things, evolved, which it might have, I don't know, it would have had to use a different process than we now think of as evolution because it can't come from there. So my big argument with intelligent design is frankly that I don't like the word intelligent in there because it kind of, to me, it's sort of downgrading God.
Mhm.
We're intelligent beings. We can't even come close to designing life. So I prefer divine design. To think that we can figure out how this happened is really hubris. And I don't know if we'll ever find out. Maybe we'll find something. I mean, even if God did create life, he did it in a way that I think we can at least struggle to learn about. So I'm not saying we give up and just say, okay, God did it, goodbye. But we do need to consider the possibility that miracles were involved in the origin of life. Now, in terms of evolution in the diversity of life, I fail to understand why that is objectionable to Christians, because to me, it's an illustration of God's majesty. What an incredibly beautiful system it is. It's perfect in the sense that it can produce so many things. And this is where, even Richard Dawkins, who I used to read a lot, has talked about the power of natural selection is really very strong. I don't think it exists on its own, but I think the evolutionary process is God given. And I think it's an argument for God, not against God. I understand that the problem is the biblical interpretation. And, and both of us have had lovely debates with Kent Hovind and others. His biblical interpretation and the interpretation of AIG is a very strange one in my view. It's and a lot of people don't understand that it's also fairly recent. I think you've made videos on this.
Mm-hmm.
The origin of this young Earth creationism, as it's now called, is what 150 years or something. It's fairly new.
Something like that. I mean, there are some
yeah.
early church fathers that do advocate it, but I mean,
Yeah.
it wasn't a major talking point,
No.
really. That
Yeah.
wasn't like the big debate going on back then.
Right. So the idea that this is, I mean, Hugh Ross has spoken beautifully about this. The idea that an old Earth is anti-biblical is just complete nonsense. Anyway,
Right.
and
So,
it's a shame that, and the real tragedy of that, and this is why I wrote the book, because you asked that earlier, and who my target is. It's a shame, I think, that so many, as you said before, so many students who are Christians and go to university and they start learning, the truth about biology and biochemistry and physics and life. And they're told, sometimes they're told by the professors, sometimes they come out on their own. Well, I can't be a Christian and accept all of this, so I have to give up my Christianity. And I wrote the book for those people. That was the reason I wrote the book, is those people need to read this book and go to church and pray thanks to God for the beautiful science that they're learning in school. There is no contradiction between the two. One supplements the other.
Right. That's a really good way to put it. But you also, in the book, you talk about something called an extended evolutionary synthesis. And I think this is important. I talk about it as much as I can because when I hear young Earth creationists or sometimes people who are in the intelligent design community, it seems like they're constantly attacking just neo-Darwinism. This idea of it's all just variation in gene frequencies. It's all just, what random genes are passed on. That's the only driving force in evolution. And very rarely do we get to talk about the other evolutionary mechanisms that could be driving evolutionary changes. And so it seems like people like you and I are kind of caught in the middle. On one side, you have the militant atheist defending evolution and a lot of times doing a pretty good job of it. But on the other side, you see like young Earth creationists or intelligent design proponents who are just attacking the neo-Darwinian perspective. But there's a third way. There's the extended evolutionary synthesis, which is multitude of different views, to be fair. And it really sort of offers new insight on how evolution could have unfolded. And so talk about that and what you go over in the book. Why is this important for understanding evolution?
I think it's very important for Christians to understand that this exists. The point is that evolutionary theory has changed since Darwin's time. It continually changed. It had a big change when the details of molecular genetics were uncovered, and people could then combine molecular genetics with evolutionary theory. And this was called the new synthesis or neo-Darwinism. That, as you said, that relied on mutations in specific genes followed by natural selection. The mutations were causing variation. And we know that variation exists. I mean, that was one of Darwin's first insights, is that not everybody in a generation is exactly identical in any animal or plant. So variation exists, and the idea for variation was these random mutations. And the other part of Darwinism that was carried over was the idea of gradualism, that, in other words, at every stage in the development from one thing to another, or from an ancient form to a more modern form, happened gradually, and each stage was accompanied by a selective advantage in natural selection. Well, what happened more recently is that we know that a lot of that is not true. Sometimes this is compared a little bit to, the breaking of Newtonian physics into, but we're not up to that. We're not there yet in biology. However, what we do know is that evolution can occur not gradually, but very suddenly. It can occur sometimes in one generation. We also know that these random mutations are, first of all, they're not all that random all the time. And second of all, they're not the only, as you said, they're not the only way to get variation. There are all kinds of mechanisms that cause variation in phenotype in the characteristics of organisms. And some of those are not random. Some of those have to do with environmental influences. Some of those different methods are related to gene expression rather than actual mutations in functional genes and structural genes, sorry. So it's a much more complicated picture than anyone thought. Now, why is that important? I think you'll get different answers, but I think it's important because when people, as you said, when people attack evolution, they're often attacking an older version of evolutionary theory. The modern version of evolutionary theory, I think, is very dynamic because this extended evolutionary synthesis is still developing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's dynamic, it's exciting, it's going into all sorts of new directions. For example, we now know, due to work by Simon Conway Morris and some other people, that there's a tremendous amount of convergence in evolution, and which means that different lineages end up doing the same thing. So why is that? Well, one explanation is that, well, there are some laws in biology that we don't know yet that are requiring, at a certain point you get wings, at another point you get eyes, at another point you get the ability to use radar. And this occurs not once, so it's not a random event that only happened once. It can happen over and over again. And that, I think, has profound implications for life and for the way life was created.
I thought that was really a good way to describe it in the book when you were kind of going over this. It was a lot of different other mechanisms from, Barbara McClintock's work on stress-induced changes to the research in evolutionary developmental biology, sometimes called Evo-Devo.
Right.
And it just seems like intelligent design proponents are showing up on a battlefield with 17th century technology, and evolutionary theory shows up with tanks and planes and bazookas. It's like, yeah, we've moved past this, guys. Let's move on.
And
Anything else you want to say about the book that you think is important for people to know? Again, it's out today. I encourage everyone to go get it. Anything else you want to add to that?
well, yeah. I just want to say one word following closing up this evolutionary story. Many atheists, evolutionary biologists, are very involved in this extended evolutionary synthesis, but I tend to see that as something that I think Christian biologists should really be very interested in, because I do believe that I don't know the answer yet, but I do believe that there is a very strong connection with the opening up of this theory to accept all kinds of new ideas. And I think there's a connection of that with Christianity. But that's all I'll say to that for now. In terms of what else to say about the book, you may have noticed I have a few fables in there. They're set aside in a different type so you can spot them. There was some controversy as to whether some of them may have been a little bit irreverent, and I guess they are, and I apologize for that in the book. But I just want people, as they're reading it, to know that, I'm not meaning any deliberate irreverence or harm or, portraying God in a way that is not usually orthodox. I like to use humor when I can, and there's some humor in the book. The fables are some of them.
I definitely didn't get that when I read the fables.
Good.
I kind of thought of it a little bit in terms of Jesus's parables. Like sometimes the guy who represents God's in Jesus' parables is ignorant of certain things here or there, like people showing up to the party, or like the prodigal son not knowing his son was going to return home at that
Right.
exact time. And it's like, come on, guys, they're just stories. Obviously, it's like a parable. So if any, I hope no one gets offended by the fables in this book. I can get where people could be offended, but you obviously set them up as fables. They're not
Right.
meant to be taken
Right.
literally.
My publisher, Kriegel Publications, is a fairly conservative Christian publisher, and one editor had a little difficulty with some of those, but not a major issue. So they were okay with it. So I think I'm probably fine. And speaking of Jesus and humor, I read, I can't remember now. I'm sorry, who may have been you. I don't know, but somebody who really knows their stuff was talking about Jesus as having an incredible sense of humor, and a lot of, talking about the mustard seed as the smallest seed. It turns out that's actually a joke because everybody knows a mustard seed is not small, and the plant that it grows from was considered a horrible weed. So the whole story of the mustard seed is actually kind of a joke. It's kind of the way, a stand-up comic would try to make a point today. So I would like to think that Jesus had a great sense of humor because I think that's important in human life.
But yeah, I thought it was overall a wonderful book. I highly encourage people
Thank
to
you.
get it.
Thank you very much.
I read it in about 2 or 3 days at the most. So it's a short book, but it's packed with a lot of very important and helpful information. So thanks for coming on talking about the book. I want this book to get out more. I think it would really help a lot of people, especially Christians maybe struggling with how can they rectify Christianity with evolution, or maybe an atheist who was in a position that you were in a couple years ago,
Mhm.
struggling, who may see some indications of theism in the data that science is revealing, but is afraid to sort of take the next step. And so I
Right.
think this book is really well written. It was a necessary book, and I appreciate you writing it.
Well, from your mouth to God's ears, all I can say.
Yeah,
Thank you, Michael.
yeah, no worries. Thanks for coming on, and
All right.
we may do more of these in the future, but I'm going to try to keep them sparse to focus more on the apologetic video library. But thanks for everybody checking in, and go out and get Sidecar's book today. It is The Works of His Hands: A Scientist's Journey from Atheism to Faith. Thank you very much.